Kia ora, everyone. Maybe I can just kick off by saying we're going to do this slightly differently, which is that we're going to invite questions sooner than perhaps you've been expecting. So we're going to have a conversation at the panel, but we're not going to wait half an hour before we ask the first question. So if we can have mics ready and questions ready, you can write your questions down now if you want to. Let me. That's right. Let me very briefly. I'm assuming everyone's read the bios and digested them, but let me just very, very quickly introduce everybody. Cal Coleman, who's the president of the Emergency Committee for American Trade. Simon Power, who's the managing director for Private Wealth and Insurance at Westpac Bank. Joanna Shelton, senior policy counsel at Google. John Wilson, the chairman of Fonterra, and Tammy Overby, who's the VP for Asia for the US Chamber. I thought I'd just kick off. I mean, we heard the 6 former USTRs yesterday. We heard Tim Grosser just now. And perhaps before we open it up to the wider sort of issues on trade and investment, TPP. What keeps you awake at night on TPP, Cal?
A great question. I would say several things keep me awake at night. One, it's more than keeping me awake, I would say is a nightmare, which is that the TPP negotiations become a redux of the Doha Development Agenda negotiations. The negotiation that could never conclude. And I think that is the basic challenge that TPP faces. And when I speak to the ministers negotiating and the negotiators of each of the countries at the table, that is their great fear, that the negotiations lose momentum. And I think there is nothing more important than members of the business community urging the negotiators not only to carry on to achieve a high standard agreement, but to do it expeditiously. Some are suggesting that a high quality agreement is antithetical to a long period of time of gestation. I think nothing is further from the truth. More time does not guarantee a higher standard agreement. The challenge is to get the job done, and the leaders need to be committed to that objective. Now, in order to get there from where we are, there are a number of steps that must be followed, and those are my other things that keep me awake at night. First, is the agreement going to be a comprehensive agreement? It's not going to be a comprehensive agreement if the sensitive issues of each country are off the table. And that does not mean everyone but the United States. It includes the United States. As some of the speakers have mentioned today and yesterday, there are very sensitive issues in the United States that need to be addressed. We can't expect Canada, for example, to open up its dairy market if we're unwilling to open up our sugar market. We can't expect other countries to do what we would like them to do if the United States does not allow increased imports of apparel into the United States. Why is apparel so important? For a country like Vietnam at the negotiating table, it's the most important product that they want to export to the other countries. If the United States refuses to greatly liberalize access to the apparel market in the United States, the net result is a country like Vietnam is not going to make the commitments on such issues that you've heard about from Bob Hormats and others, such as intellectual property, on investment. So what I would say is the sensitive issues must be addressed, but they must be addressed early, not late. The tendency is to leave all the sensitive issues to the end of a negotiation. That just won't do if we're going to meet the objective of getting the talks done expeditiously. 2 other quick areas that I would mention. One is the area of, how should I put it, dealing with the 21st century issues. I worry at night that we're not going to be able to tackle them. It is very, very difficult. You've heard some of those. There are such issues as simplifying the supply chain, When I speak to members of the business community, many will talk about tariffs, but that's not next. What's next is not how high the tariffs are going to be. We need to eliminate them. We all know that. What's next is dealing with simplifying the supply chain. If business has any challenge today, it's that what Minister Grosser talked about and others have talked about, the spaghetti bowl. The system is so complex in terms of the different trade agreements. The dirty secret is that many businesses do not avail themselves of the benefits that are provided by trade agreements. Why? It doesn't make sense to tailor their provision of services by the basis of what each trade agreement requires. They need a single standard. And quite frankly, simplifying the supply chain for many businesses, whether it's in the United States or I dare say in the other countries, is absolutely critical. It means dealing with what some are talking about as behind the border issues, dealing with such issues as the different regulations on access to markets that exist in each country. That is an example of a 21st century issue that needs to be addressed. Whether it will be addressed is the one that we have to see, and I believe it can be, but it's going to require a great deal of work. To conclude, the last thing that keeps me awake at night, and I would have to say, in terms of what we're talking about right now, is trade agreements, and this is a question of what's next. Trade agreements have to borrow from the closer economic relationship between New Zealand and Australia. There's one set of provisions that if it's not in TPP will mean that TPP is yesterday's trade agreement and not next or tomorrow's trade agreement. And that is that the TPP to be next has to be an evergreen accord. And by evergreen, I simply mean structures need to be put in place in the agreement that allow regulators and other government officials on a regular basis to come together to talk about what needs to be done that was not contemplated when the agreement was signed. Let me give you a good example. The last time a trade agreement that the United States entered was completed, no one looked at such an issue as cross-border data flow. No company today, whether it's a manufacturer or service provider, can do its business on a global basis if information cannot flow freely across borders, providing, of course, for protection for privacy. If you don't have a system in place that allows for what's next and the next issues to be addressed by an agreement, as soon as the agreement is signed, and let's say it's signed in ink, and we're not using some of the wonderful systems that are being developed today by Google and others, but let's say it's signed in ink, it's outdated. It's yesterday's agreement. And so you need to have an evergreen proposal or an evergreen component of the trade agreement that allows those issues to be addressed. I could go on, but I'm going to turn it over to whomever's speaking next.
Thank you, Cal. Simon, nightmare or hallucination?
Well, I'm sleeping pretty well, actually, overall. But in respect of TPP, a couple of issues. I completely agree with the point on momentum, and to use the Minister's phrase that these processes are gut-achingly difficult. I think keeping a strong focus on a commercial pace of negotiation and conclusion is, in this sense, for businesses like many of those represented on the panel today, more significant than the considerations around political pace. And the timeliness of the delivery is going to matter for business and for investors as they watch this process unfold. Could I just add briefly from a New Zealand perspective, I think one of the challenges that I do think about a bit with TPP is the level of domestic understanding around TPP and its particular importance to economic growth and prosperity. And I think that we've all got a task when leaving here, including our good friends in the media, to make sure that the domestic implications for growth, and including TPP, are understood more broadly, that it's not necessarily just an academic exercise being modelled at a global level, that it actually does matter in a real and tangible way to small businesses in countries like New Zealand, and the opportunities that they will have globally, and the effect that that would have on employment and other really important domestic issues. So I think it's incumbent on all of us to be speaking more specifically in a domestic environment about the upside of this particular initiative.
Thanks, Simon. Joanna?
We are very hopeful at Google that the TPP concludes with strong 21st century language, including cross-border data flows and other important pieces that really enable the digital economy to continue to thrive and take account for what is inevitable in the future. There are right now, of the 7 billion people on the planet, there are 2 billion connected to the internet. That means there are 5 billion more that will become connected in the next few years. So that is a pretty startling perspective to take, along with the advances that internet access will have, and New Zealand has been such a leader in that front. The technology will continue to advance. There are tiny computers now in watches, in sneakers, in glasses, and so I just wanted to demonstrate. I was on vacation in New Zealand, and I can only imagine if I had this in Queenstown, all the speedboat rides and hiking and all the other things I would be able to do, just taking a picture just like this. Okay, glass, take a picture. That's it. This is really quite remarkable. I can search for, as my husband said this morning, you could actually learn the steps of the haka by using one of these. So we are very, very hopeful that we have an unprecedented opportunity to really modernize trade policy to reflect the economic engine of the internet. It is not just a Google issue. It is not just an internet company issue. It is an issue across all sectors, companies big and small, that are using the internet to export, to increase their productivity, to find, to recruit talent. The drivers of today's information economy it's more important that you have information, knowledge, and human capital than necessarily all the raw materials that we've had in the trade policy geared towards an industrial economy. So we really are hopeful that this is a point where we can really put in place a modern framework that will account for the innovation that is to come.
John?
Yes. In our business in Deering, the thing that keeps me awake is that we approach the future rather than look over our shoulder in the past. And we've got to take the frameworks in dairy that the future offer us, instead of looking all the time with a framework that says, hey, this is what it was like 1 decade or 2 decades ago. I thought that on the opening evening after our former, I quite like that saying, the former, our Right Honourable Jim Bolger had spoken, and then one of our young future partners, I think Julie Skeets was her name, I don't know if Julie's here today, but she stood up and made the comment that, 1984, I wasn't even born then. And I thought that was very instructive. And so we have to look forward rather than look back. And I would look around the other key negotiating countries in TPP, and those in the dairy framework, I fear, are taking yesterday rather than tomorrow. And if I may, I just might put a couple of slides up really quickly. And it's just important to have a look at the numbers. I don't know if we can do that. Just if you have a quick look at this, what this just shows is how rapidly the dairy dynamic is changing globally. And this is looking out to 2020. It's actually a slide that Malcolm Bailey put up yesterday. But the round bubbles, they're referring to the size of the markets. And I think what's important to just look at is just look at the growth. So if you look at the growth in dairying, it is centred very much around China, Middle East and North Africa. And what we're seeing in the areas of the United States and Europe is very little demand growth. So where is that going to come from? And I think this here just tells the story which I believe certainly that the US dairy industry hasn't yet fully got its head around. That if you look at the size and scale of the big bubble on the right-hand side, that is looking at demand growth going forward through to 2020. And we're going to need another 100 billion litres of milk in that time period. That is twice the size of the US dairy industry, which is currently 87 billion litres, and 5 times the size of the full New Zealand dairy industry. So we are predicting significant growth through the period, and the question is, when we look to the demand growth coming out of Asia, where is that milk going to come from? And it is certainly not going to come from New Zealand. It is going to come from the US largely, and I think it just provides huge opportunity for dairy producers in the US. So that's what keeps me awake at night, making sure that we focus forward, not behind us.
Thanks, John. Tammy.
Well, like Simon, I sleep very well. I was fortunate yesterday to return from round 17 in Lima. And I want to echo what Cal said. In our meeting with the Vietnamese chief negotiator, he was quite blunt. He said it's very simple. If Vietnam doesn't get market access to the US textile market, we are not politically able to do the very difficult things that the United States is asking. So we do hope very much that in order to achieve this 21st century agreement, that the US government can understand the need to make sure it is a balanced agreement and that our trade partners are equally able to get enough reward in the agreement to be able to sell it domestically. Also, I would agree with the comment that was made that we need increasing strong political will in order to get this done. We met with 6 of the 11 chief negotiators there, and all of them are still saying they're hoping and working very hard for a October Bali conclusion. Of course, please remember the Japanese are not at the table yet. That was another interesting point. We asked every negotiator we met with, when will the Japanese join the negotiation? No one could give a definitive answer. I met with 3 different Japanese media bureaus, and they all assured me that Japan will be at the KL round in July. Whether they'll be at the table or not, I think remains to be seen. But like my colleagues, this is the single most important trade agreement that the United States has the ability to influence and to ensure an early completion. We need to take full advantage of it. I would also echo the point about the media. You have one of the most important roles in this entire agreement to ensure your domestic public fully understands how critical the completion of this agreement is to all the economies in Asia. Thank you.
Thanks, Tammy. Let's take some questions from the floor. If there are, yep, we got one here. Is there a mic? You can speak loud. You can come to the podium. Yeah.
Get on up here.
Thank you. My name is Branwen Miller. I'm a New Zealand future partner currently in New York studying. And I'd love to hear your ideas about how immigration fits into the context of how we talk about trade in the next 20 odd years. You're talking about knowledge economies and human capital, and we're heading closer to open borders in a lot of other respects. But it seems to be often the elephant in the room when we're talking about these issues, and it's sort of something we're not really touching on a lot. I'd love to hear your input into how we're going to incorporate the human part of the trade. Thanks.
Well, that's a fantastic question. Who would like to start with that one? Cal?
I think you've hit one of the 21st century issues, but it was also the 19th century issue, the movement of persons across borders. I don't know whether to give you the good news or the bad news first. From the perspective of our US negotiators, their hands are tied. If they had the complete freedom to do what they know needs to be done, would put their support behind very expansive provisions to allow, especially for business professionals, to cross borders in order to ensure that projects in various countries can go forward that require their expertise. The problem is that their hands are tied. This is very much an issue that the legislators in the Congress have said does not belong in a new trade agreement. As a result, there's very little that they can agree to in the TPP. That's the bad news. The good news is that legislation in our Congress is moving forward on immigration, one of the most important portions of what is being negotiated and has a very strong likelihood of being approved, is an agreement that would allow for movement of persons, especially business professionals. And that would mean that you would see what we wish we could agree to in TPP being done in domestic law. So if something can be worked out in TPP, we will probably be doing something in parallel in domestic legislation. That's the good news. The bad news is, in terms of the TPP, there's very little that our government is allowed to do because of the restrictions being placed on the executive branch by the legislature.
Anyone else got perspectives on this? Simon?
Thanks very much for throwing that over to me, Gabs. Look, I mean, as a former, I might employ some of the old skills and just ignore the question and talk about something else. There's no doubt that this is an issue which is always going to cause considerable domestic attention and angst in the New Zealand environment. But one of the things that inevitably will come from the global flow of capital and increased global flow of capital under an agreement like TPP will be the necessary pooling of talent. And I think actually that the pooling of talent is a grossly underestimated force for where young, highly skilled human capital decides to head. It wants to be around other highly skilled human capital. And I think that the free flow of capital will inevitably lead to more pressure on negotiators in agreements like TP, but also in the domestic environment to see the capability for talent to pull where it wants to pull. Arguably, you see a bit of that in some domestic economies already, but I think it's inevitably going to become a more regionalised and global phenomena.
Tammy?
As Cal explained, it is very difficult to put an immigration issue in a trade agreement. They're under different committees of jurisdiction. Our judiciary handles immigration. And those of you who are familiar with the US-Australia FTA will remember that there was a side letter after the FTA was concluded that did include some highly skilled labor, a provision for free flow. One of the few areas where the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the AFL-CIO actually agree is on immigration. And I believe, as Cal does, that we will see immigration reform this year, and we're all pushing very hard that the portion that would allow the free flow of highly skilled labor back and forth be included. So we're quite optimistic.
Okay.
I agree with that. It's a very important issue. I think the pressure will come organically to make progress on this issue domestically as well as on the trade front. I agree with Simon completely. You know, you're seeing more and more distributed access to capital, distributed access to human capital as well. We have our folks on the ground in New Zealand like to use a YouTube star who is actually out of Perth, but he's a chef, and he happens to have one of the best YouTube videos about how to make Play-Doh. And he is now making 6 figures a year off of the advertising revenue he shares from Google from that video. So there's, you know, that stuff will organically put pressure on the system, we believe.
Wow. We got one more question over here. Is there a, yep, cool.
Kia ora, I'm Kieran Brown from the Fulbright Future Partners Program. A couple of you have really made the point that what keeps you up at night is the challenge of looking forward and not in the rear vision mirror. But a lot of you will be involved in strategy making in various capacities at board level or executive level. So what has to change about the way, as nations and as major multinationals, the way we make strategy? What needs to change?
John.
Oh, it's how we tell the story. I think in strategy now, in a world that where information just shifts so rapidly, it is the way that business leaders are able to tell their story that our political leaders can tell the story. I think there is no shortage of, well, my experience, I can only speak for our own experiences, is that there's no shortage of heavily analysed quantitative data which forms strategies and boardroom and senior management team discussion. It's our ability to tell the story and take our people with us, as Simon touched on earlier. That is the way that we can really drive these sort of trade discussions and to be able to allow this free flow of goods and services across borders. I look out at a future, certainly in our industry, that is moving rapidly from a transactional relationship between businesses to very close, innovative R&D relationships to be able to provide solutions to our ultimate customers. And the only way you can do that is if you can get very close linkages. And if you're trying to battle trade barriers in our world, tariffs and poor rulings around sanitary and phytosanitary and all these sort of things, that just makes that very difficult. And it means that we can't solve these challenges in front of us. And it's interesting when you look at the nutrition challenge, it covers the spectre from malnutrition, about 1 billion people apparently, malnutrition based around Asia, right through to real challenges now around obesity and diabetes at the other end of the spectrum. And so, how do we ensure that we can get the best knowledge in the world across businesses to be able to solve these challenges? So it's telling the story.
Cal?
I think there's a real disconnect. I'd be interested to hear about the experience of New Zealand, but there's a real disconnect in the United States. And I'll tell you about some research that my group, the Emergency Committee for American Trade, did. We began with a hypothesis that Americans that we were going to interview really didn't understand the value of international trade and the benefits that international trade would bring. And that accounted for their lack of support for international trade. And so we did focus groups around the country. And our null hypothesis was proven wrong. Everyone we interviewed, whether they were working on the line in a manufacturing facility or in management at major American companies, spoke like economists. Because of international trade, they said, the quality of our products here in the United States that we can purchase are much higher. Because of international trade, we have greater choice. And they went on and on. You would have thought they were economists. When we asked them about their views on international trade, they were very, very negative on international trade. And what we realized is that they're using international trade in the United States as a way of addressing their anxiety about the future and what's next. They were afraid that they or their children or their grandchildren would not have security. They would not have what they needed for a good life in terms of secure jobs, in terms of their ability to provide for themselves. And so the conclusion that many of us drew from these focus groups is a very complex one, but also a very simple one. And it is that if we want the support for international trade, we have to, in many of our countries, and I'm speaking about the United States, but I believe it's very different in New Zealand, deal with these social issues. These are domestic issues that need to be resolved. And if they're resolved, I think the support would be there for the international trade that is a very hard sell in the United States.
I think the simple answer to your question is flexibility. When you look forward to the future, what you absolutely need at the core is flexibility and where innovation will lead. We think of lots of different components of how that manifests itself in trade. First, cross-border information flows, that's been mentioned by most folks up here. Governments that actively encourage and protect cross-border information flows will benefit from increased investment and economic growth. That's just a simple statement. You look at data location requirements, which actually sort of counterintuitively hurt economies by decreasing efficiencies, undermining where modern computing is going in terms of internet computing, restrict the ability of in-country businesses, particularly small and medium-sized businesses, to export and grow by capitalizing on the digital marketing techniques to find and locate customers around the world that are willing and able to buy their products and services. You look at holding intermediaries liable for other people's users' expression. That is something that absolutely stifles innovation and hurts economic growth and will keep a country back if they have policies that don't reflect the ability to have platforms by which commerce and expression and information can move. You look at economic growth in the internet sector and beyond really does require clear, flexible, and balanced intellectual property rules and enforcement, including flexible limitations and exceptions that enable innovation and future advances in technology to occur. You look at privacy protections that was also mentioned. I think that needs to be done very carefully to avoid unintended consequences on innovation and growth. When Europe did their first data protection directive, investment in online advertising instantly dried up by 249 million in Europe, right? So there's potentially some reasons why there's other countries that are more open and flexible for innovation that you will see the investment.
Simon?
To get the buy-in, I think, in the New Zealand context that you were talking about in the US context was a very interesting flip in that research. To John's point, the narrative and the story has to be right. That links into your point, Karen, I think, about the strategy. But I've got to be I'm less concerned about strategy and more concerned about the doing of it, right? And I think one of the areas where perhaps not just in trade or in politics, but in business, you can get yourself into real difficulty is tying yourself up in knots about the strategic positioning. Actually getting out there and making the project real for the people that are going to benefit from it and having tangible short-term results to show them will help drive that narrative in a way that gets you the buy-in. Continual production of strategic documentation is a great methodology in its own right, but I would err strongly on the side of being able to tell the story in a way that points to real benefit for particularly smaller businesses who would, arguably be the part of the economy who had the most concerns about a broader global flow of capital and trade.
Thanks, Simon. Can I actually turn to the room and pause? The question, we all seem to be pretty comfortable here with the idea of international trade and free trade and TPP and what the future looks like. So why is it that we're not able to get greater buy-in across our communities? Why is Cal's survey coming up with such? Is it that as simple as a security issue, job security, or is it we just communicate poorly? Any reflections from anybody on that? Actually, and anybody actually think that free trade and all that stuff is a bad idea? Because we're all assuming. We all agree. So if anyone wants to put an opposite view, do. I think there's a question, there's a hand in the middle there. And one over there.
Mike Macetic of PBS Online NewsHour. Picking up on some of the comments, first of all, I'm beginning to think that optimism may be New Zealand's best export, because it's been a long time since I've been at a panel with Washington insiders expressing optimism that the U.S. Congress can do anything. But following up on that, and actually sort of following up on your point as well, for the kind of TPP that you guys are talking about and you want, you're going to have to get through now, particularly with Japan joining in, 3 powerful caucuses, especially in the House of Representatives. The domestic auto, sugar, and textiles. Could those of you who are familiar with our Congress give us some idea about how you're going to get over those hurdles?
Cal?
John.
I can't promise an answer that'll be fully satisfying, but let me give it a try. I would say that the key to a successful TPP being endorsed by the United States Congress rests, and it's an exaggeration, but not by far, on the provisions on some very traditional issues. There is no trade agreement that could have the support of the lower body or the upper body without the support of the agriculture community in the United States. That is the situation that any trade agreement faces. If you don't have each of the, or almost all of the various ag sectors on board, it is DOA, dead on arrival. The second thing I would say to you is that when it comes to TPP, you have broad support right now in the United States Congress for the concept of TPP. That's not the specifics, but the concept. And what we're not talking about is the multiple ways in which TPP is viewed in the United States. It is viewed both as a commercial agreement, but also as a security/regional agreement that has benefits that go beyond the commercial sphere. And that means that you have members of such committees as committees that deal with defense, foreign affairs, who look at it through different prisms than those, for example, who focus on the commercial aspects, such as ways and means and finance. The bottom line is, when votes are going to be taken in the US Congress, they will be looking to their constituents, and I'm sure it's very similar in many other countries that have a presidential system rather than a ministerial system. But they will be looking to their constituents, and they will say, have your needs been met? If again and again they hear from their services community, their agriculture community, their manufacturing community, that this agreement means jobs and economic growth in the districts and the states, the votes are going to be there. I would say there's a lot of work to be done on some of the sectors that are traditionally against trade agreements. I would have to tell you, within the sector of yarn and fabric, they will say that they need certain provisions, but even if they get those provisions, history shows that they still in the end oppose an agreement. In the case of autos, the verdict is still out. There are parallel negotiations, and this really has to do with Japan. There are parallel negotiations that will go on at the same time as TPP between the United States and Japan to try to address the auto issues. And then I think you mentioned one other sector, maybe was it sugar? I can't remember. But I don't believe, no matter what is done on sugar, whether it's a little more sugar coming into the United States or a lot more sugar that can come into the United States, that the sugar lobby will ever support a trade agreement such as the one that's being negotiated on TPP.
Terry.
If I could just make a couple of observations. First, the last 3 trade agreements to pass Congress passed with record votes. I was active in the U.S.-Korea agreement. We had 83 Senate votes in favor of passage. Also, when you speak about the Japanese coming to the table, I think it's important to note that Japan has had 2 stalled decades. That's not lost on the people of Japan. Prime Minister Abe went against all predictions and actually has brought Japan to the table before the summer upper house elections. All political pundits, both in the US and Japan, were saying that he would not do that until after the elections. But he recognized the direness of Japan's situation, that they are being left behind. Also, he has created a new mechanism inside the Japan ministries that have Economic Minister Amari able to go around the agriculture minister. And Minister Amari has 100 new staff that are just dedicated to TPP. 70 of those diplomats will be working on the TPP negotiations. The other 30 will be focused on domestic consultations. So I'm actually quite excited about what we're seeing from the Japanese. This is not your father's Japan here. This is a Japan that understands this is possibly their last chance to regain the status and the momentum for growth that their nation desperately needs.
Thanks, Tammy.
Just to give it a New Zealand perspective, because I'd hate our American colleagues in the audience to think that our optimism is born of a simplistic electoral arrangement. So we have in effect what is a multilateral negotiation for a political system, and whilst the two major parties as part of the negotiation have historically had a bipartisan view on trade issues, largely thanks to Ambassador Moore and his colleague Clayton Cosgrove, who are sitting on the other side of the House to the current government. But this is an historic strand of consistent policy. That doesn't mean that the electoral environment in New Zealand allows for immediate and deliverable outcomes for those two major political parties. So there is a dynamic within the New Zealand electoral context as well, which demands, a fair amount of internal negotiation and positioning in order that this level of optimism can be shared globally.
There was another question in the middle of the room. Is it still? Yep. Two, in fact.
So the question was, why is it difficult?
Yeah.
Thank you. So Sal D'Agostino. So I just put the point that, so what seems tricky here is that you don't get to try it before you buy it. And that, in effect, from a security perspective, if someone comes to us in the world and says, trust me, it'll work, you run away. There seems to me a fundamental challenge here is how do you get something right that you don't have any experience with, particularly at the population level. Sure, all the trade experts might sort of have their predicted outcomes, but from the population perspective, what experience do we have with trade agreements that could actually inform our emotions? And just put that out as an observation and whether you think that's a challenge.
I think that's a good point. I also think personally that we don't invest enough in the simple things, which is explaining. I think one of the downsides of free trade agreements is that they become big legal sort of negotiations almost, that success is taken as the signing of the agreement, where actually success ought to be what it delivers and how it's received. There was another question behind you. We'll just come back. Let me just get...
Ed Gerwin, Senior Fellow for Trade at Third Way. I want to focus a little bit more on what's next. We've talked about the TPP as the eventual platform for a true pan-Pacific trade agreement, which eventually would include China. I think everyone acknowledges that that is the long-term goal. But the question I have is, how do we get to that long-term goal? What do you all think in the short or medium term governments and businesses should be doing so that in, say, 2020, we get to a true pan-Pacific trade agreement that includes all of the major countries in that region? Thank you.
Tammy, do you want to start?
Ed, of course, you would ask the hardest question of the day. But my observation there would be that we complete TPP. If we complete TPP and we're true to our original negotiating objectives, where it is comprehensive, high standard, it will achieve the goals that we have set out for ourselves. And these are incredibly ambitious goals. But if we do that, and we do it in a way that is transparent and that is binding and enforceable, we will achieve those objectives, and that, I believe, will continue to get the attention of our Chinese friends and make them more amenable to wanting to join. I think it is no surprise that RCEP was created because TPP was gaining momentum. The fact that the Japanese, when they announced their interest to join TPP, a country like Indonesia, who heretofore had said we're not interested at all, suddenly decided that their view on TPP was evolving. And Pat Gita went from, I don't care about TPP, to tell me what's going on. So I think the best thing we can do is complete what we started as quickly as possible and communicate the results, that it is working.
John?
Just following on from those comments, I'll just get a couple of little anecdotes. They're only sound bites, but I think they're quite important. So in the last 5 weeks, I've spent 2 of those weeks in China. It's very interesting that the first conversation is actually about food security, is how are we going to feed our people? And so that is a significant change, and that is why the optimism, I mean, the momentum is just there in our sector around food and agriculture generally, that we have to come up with solutions. I mean, by 2050, the current math is that we need to increase food production by 70%. I mean, if you just think about that challenge. And when we are in New Zealand, if we are talking to our neighbours in Asia, Philippines, Myanmar, Indonesia, and I've been involved in meetings with all of those senior leaders over the last 2 or 3 months, it is exactly the same conversation, food security. So that game has changed dramatically, which changes the dynamic. And the other little comment I would make is that I was also in Japan in the last 10 days or so, and I think Japan coming into TPP does all of a sudden actually become an enabler. And what was interesting for me is that I met with 3 of the largest dairy companies in Japan when I was there. And the conversation was not if TPP, it is when. And that is just such a significant mindset change which has occurred only in the last month or 2. So they see it as inevitable, and their discussion with the New Zealand dairy sector is, so how do we make the changes that are required? And give us time.
Thanks, John. Joanna?
I think from my perspective, we are hopeful again. I think the importance of the internet and having movement of information across borders is found within the TPP, from the Peruvian flower shops to Chilean winemakers to Vietnam artists. We know that people are using the internet to reach their global customer base in really innovative ways from the ground up in these countries. So I think, you talked about 2020. It will be a whole new world, and we are very optimistic on that front.
Cal?
On the first question about education, the sad story in the United States is the trade field has a 5-letter word in the United States, and that's NAFTA. And it is a failure of colossal proportion on the inability to explain to the broader public the benefits that NAFTA has brought to the United States. Quite frankly, if you look at post-NAFTA, the exports of agricultural and also of services and manufactured products to Mexico from the United States has skyrocketed. It has been a big success, but we need to work better with the media to tell that story, because the story simply is not understood. And I want to just agree on the second question with Tammy. Nothing succeeds like success. And if we have an outstanding agreement on Trans-Pacific Partnership, other countries will recognize the value of the agreement, and they will want to come on board. It will be not only Japan, but the fact that if it's successful and has an evergreen component, the other countries, as Minister Grosser pointed out, can basically bolt on. Yeah. They can join the talks. They can join at a second stage and become part of what is going to be what we think will be a tremendously successful enterprise that benefits not just the 11, soon 12 countries in the negotiations, but the entire Asia Pacific.
Thanks, Cal. Can I ask the panel, we've got about 10 minutes to go. Can I ask the panel whether they see a trade-off between speed and momentum? I mean, what does success mean? A TPP by October or a high-quality TPP perhaps later? I mean, ideally, we want everything now, but if the Japanese are going to turn up in July, something tells me that October looks pretty, well, it would be remarkable. So what does success look like? Tammy?
From my perspective, I think we have to let the substance drive the timing. And having Japan at the table is absolutely a game changer for American business. And if the negotiations go on an additional 6 months or a year, I think that is absolutely fine. I think it's more important that we get it right, but that we avoid what Cal talked about, the Doha syndrome. We just don't let it drag on forever. My Japanese colleagues are well aware that all eyes will be upon them when they enter the negotiation, that they need to do it in a manner that Canada and Mexico join, so that it was perceived from the outside that they hit the ground running, they were prepared, and they were constructive in their early time at the table. But I'm the optimist here. I believe it's absolutely going to happen, whether it's by October or in 2014. I don't think it really matters that much. As long as we get it done, it's comprehensive and high standard.
October sounds tight, but November would be good.
That's right.
I think for us it is just this no exclusivity is very important. Yep. So all the points that Tammy makes, very comprehensive agreement. But really importantly for the ag sector, and I suspect it goes a lot wider, is to ensure that we've got strong rules based on good science, and that we can't find a solution where you just get non-tariff barriers thrown up in front of us in the future. So simple, high-quality deal. Sounds very easy, rolls off the tongue well. I understand that there's a huge amount of work to achieve that, but it's about the will that is there to achieve it, and the leadership certainly seems to be there.
Joanna?
Agree. We have an opportunity to really modernize and put in place high-quality agreement, which is very important. Even at Google, we understand that trade agreements don't happen in internet time, so we're a little bit patient for that.
Yeah, I'm not patient, and and I just think that a very bright official said to me a couple of days ago, we've got to decide whether success looks like more countries joining in or actually getting something done.
Yeah.
And I'm in the getting something done category. And I'm also in the category of, firmly believing that strong, driven, practical, outcome-measured momentum sucks in doubters and people with one foot in each camp. And the harder you drive this with those participants that, are still making their minds up or may be useful in the future, they will bolt on when they see the value. So let's get the train moving, rather than sitting at the platform and waiting for everybody to get on.
I'm in Simon's camp all the way. I believe I've been very talking about what keeps me awake at night, and I went through a long list of those things. But I have to say, I am among those who believe that a major outcome can still be announced this year, calendar year 2013. I know we often are talking about what's next. I think this is now. This is the year to get a major, major job done. And I love all the political leaders. I work with many of the political leaders in the United States. I've met many leaders from around the world. And I have to say, I do worry that our leadership, although they're all excellent, will go on to the next best thing. If we do not get TPP done expeditiously, there will be crises that arise, there will be other issues that pull them away, and no matter how much they want to do TPP, they may not be able to give it the attention that it needs. Remember, the hard issues have yet to be addressed. These are the political issues. What do you do about dairy? What do you do about such issues as sugar? What do you do about cross-border data flow? What do you do about intellectual property, sanitary and phytosanitary? These are decisions that are going to be made at the highest levels of the various governments. If they can't make these decisions now, I am not optimistic they can make it tomorrow. So while I recognize the importance of next, I have to say, I believe this is now and it needs to be done. So let me throw my weight behind Simon's presentation.
So where does the audience sit on this? Any questions or perspectives on the trade-off between speed and quality?
You've got one in the middle over there.
Just behind you.
Very bright lights, aren't they? Bright lights, aren't they?
Kia ora. My name's Kiwa Huata. I'm part of the Future Partners. Not very good with public speaking, so I wrote it down. At a public forum on 6th of July 2011, legal experts in New Zealand presented their concerns that the agreement could undermine law regarding multicultural, genetic modification, copyright, and remove subsidised medicine New Zealanders have access to through Pharmac. Opponent says US corporations are hoping to weaken Pharmac's ability to get inexpensive generic medicines by forcing New Zealand to pay for brand name. The New Zealand government denies the claims, and Trade Negotiations Minister Tim Grozer says opponents of the deals are fools who are trying to wreck this agreement, and I think that's bullshit. I'm only a third-year economics student, and even I can see who are the winners and who are the losers. 2 questions. Will we protect those that are vulnerable to globalisation and trade, or are we just feeding the 1%? Kia ora.
Good question.
I'm happy to
Tammy
jump
wants
right
to
in.
kick off, yeah.
First of all, I think you raised some very valid points. In every agreement, trade or otherwise, there are always winners and losers. In America, when we do trade agreements, they're always tied to something called trade adjustment assistance. I think we have to be honest with ourselves and with our citizens that yes, this agreement won't benefit every single person. But if we take care of those it doesn't, and also we look at the broader macro picture, in the broad scope, does the majority benefit? And I think too often in trade agreements, we also forget about the consumer. One of the things that these trade agreements do is they bring high quality, lower cost products to citizens all over the world, but we always forget that, and we just focus on bad big companies. Well, I don't apologize for working for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. I'm actually very proud of America's largest big companies. I think we do an incredible service for the world. But I do think that you are absolutely right that in every agreement there are some people who suffer, and we all need to do our best to take care of them.
Thanks, Tammy. John?
Every government, I would expect, would need to take very careful care and consideration of social considerations, but I do fall very much to points that Tammy was just making. You know, just reflect back on Minister Grocer and what was done during the Uruguay round, and the impact that the Uruguay round had on New Zealand's economic growth was quite extraordinary. And that economic growth is what drives the social platforms across our country. And so for me, that is what is so important about our little country at the bottom in the South Pacific. Trade is everything to us, and it falls on Simon and his former mates as to how we very responsibly, and the point is very responsibly, are aware of the concerns that you make.
Thanks, John. Joanna?
I think we're focused more on creating open platforms for then people to use their creativity and expression to sell their goods or sell their services or do whatever. The irony is, and particularly in New Zealand, I think the consumers are way ahead of the small businesses. So consumer on internet activity, and consumers are banking and they're doing They're doing all kinds of things online. They're applying for passports online. They're doing all kinds of government services online in New Zealand. But I think it's only 35% of New Zealand's small businesses have a web presence and are utilizing that to export their goods abroad. So the irony in New Zealand is I think consumers are way ahead of some of those businesses.
Simon?
Well, I think, good on you for asking the question, actually. I also think that, the New Zealand system of government allows for these debates to be had pretty robustly, actually, was my experience. And I think that our system of government reflects the variety of views, some of which have been expressed today, some of which you expressed from the quotes that you gave, in a way that actually, brings the debate to the surface in a domestic environment like New Zealand. The trick is to make sure that all sides of the argument are put in a way where people can form, their own views and make them informed. I think that the trade representatives yesterday, though, and I mean that was, at the risk of stating the obvious, an astonishing session to have those six people on the stage together representing such a range of administrations and to some extent views. Their advice I took fundamentally as being to keep our eye on the big picture here. And the big picture from where I'm sitting is that, New Zealand is a trading nation. That is how we derive our incomes. That is fundamentally how we derive our wealth. And in order for, to use the hackneyed cliche, for the tide to lift all boats, it's important that the macroeconomic settings in New Zealand are enhanced by things and opportunities like international trade. So I would, I'm clearly in favour of the movement of talent and capital and trade agreements. But I do think that, the debate will continue to be had. The trick is, I think, to think of it more broadly and what the flip side would be. What if you didn't do it?
Thanks, Simon. Cal?
I just wanted to mention one word in terms of my answer, and that's jobs. A great deal of what is being discussed in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, in the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, RCEP, and we can go on, is about jobs. And some may view these trade agreements as business-centric, but I would make the case that what this is all about is two things: growing our economies and providing jobs, either new jobs, or I hasten to add, which is often not said, supporting the jobs that we have in our economies right now. Because you look at the United States, for example, there are only so many more products that our companies can sell to a US audience, which is fully satisfied with what they have now. Google is the great exception that proves the rule because they keep coming up with new things that we all need. But for many of our products, whether they're food products or other products, our companies have provided everything that a large part of our population needs. Where are we going to find the markets for these products? Often they're going to be in other countries around the world. And when we find our ability is increased to access those markets, and the countries that we're trading with have more access to our markets, we get the jobs, we ensure that the jobs that we now have are supported, and it's a win-win. We all win. And it's not business versus labor. We're all going to benefit. And I guess in one way, I'll just conclude by saying many of us are very much Benthamites. We believe in what Jeremy Bentham said many, many years back, and that is policy is about the greatest good for the greatest number. And I think that is what TPP is about. That is what multilateral trade agreements are about. And I think in the end, I'm the optimist. I have to tell you, I've been putting on my other hat when talking about other issues. I believe it's going to get done because of the reasons in the end. Our politicians will recognize, our people will support them, that this is in their best interest.
Thanks very much, Cal. I'm going to invite Ambassador Moore to make some concluding remarks. I mean, I think that statement from Cal is a good way to wrap. In many ways, the challenge is for all of us and the media, in particular through the media, to explain the Benthamite principles which will ultimately reflect the good for all of us.
Well,
Ambassador.
There's not a lot I can add to this, but I think we've had a superb couple of days, the USTRs, your good selves here. But we have to keep making the case at home, and the question is, why do you do it? You do it because you want jobs. You do it because you want to create wealth, and we can't share wealth unless we create it. And I make I promised our minister that the TPP ambassadors here, we're working as a group, our officials are working, we're fired up. As I said to our Prime Minister, we're giving it everything we've got. We're prepared to work into the wee hours of the afternoon, even Fridays. Okay.
Thanks, Mike. I think that was also a clap for the panel, but just in case it wasn't, please clap the panel.
I like the way you handled this.
Thank you, Carl.
It was the most alive session.